Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. It's been 10 years since a street vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire in a desperate protest against injustice, inequality and corruption. His plight resonated with many across the country and was a spark of a revolution that brought the Tunisian dictator Bin Ali to his knees. The events in the small coastal country set off a chain reaction of uprisings across North Africa and the Middle East in what became known around the world as the Arab Spring. Haidar Abbasi has more.
It began in one country but spread rapidly across an entire region. Mass uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring. Dictators fell, countries were reshaped, and lives transformed. The trigger was in this small town in Tunisia. In December 2010, police confiscated a street vendor's produce because he refused to pay them a bribe. Unable to recover his only means to a livelihood, Mohammed Bouaziz set himself on fire. His despair was echoed by many Tunisians who complained of poverty, inequality, and corruption. Soon, millions were on the streets demanding change. In a matter of weeks, President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia. It was the first time a leader of an Arab state was forced out by a popular uprising. Other Arab nations shared some of Tunisia's problems, and inspired by the events there, anti-government protests spread like wildfire. From Morocco to Yemen, millions rose up to call for democracy, greater social freedoms, equality, and justice. But the outcomes in each country have varied. Some, like Tunisia, transitioned to a democracy. In others, like Egypt, there was a counter-revolution and a return to authoritarianism. In the worst cases, Libya and Syria, the uprisings developed into brutal civil wars. A few protesters have expressed regret for taking to the streets, lamenting that their lives were better before the revolution, even if it meant living under a tyrant. Tunisia is often presented as a success story, but a decade later, many of its citizens say they've seen few improvements.
There have been no changes after the revolution. On the contrary, things get worse every day.
I'm a friend of Mohammed Bouaziz. May his soul rest in peace. He got angry and he burned himself. We stood by him, we fought for our social situation, but nothing has changed until this moment.
The optimism at the beginning of the uprisings was eventually crushed by war, mass displacement, and the return of despots. Observers have described the aftermath as the Arab Winter. Haidar Abbasi, Straight Talk.
And to discuss this further, joining me in the studio, Yasin Asal, who is an assistant professor at Istanbul Ticaret University, and from London, Maha Azzam, who is the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, and from Doha, Mahjoob Zweiri. He is the director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. A warm welcome to you all. Or let me begin with you, since you're in the studio 10 years on since the start of the Arab Spring. Where does the region stand now? And is the revolution still alive?
This is one of the most controversial issues, both regional and global politics today, that we are discussing. Is that really a revolution or not? When we look at the post discussions after the revolution, there are still some structural problems in those countries, such as Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. This is why this is one of the debatable issues. That revolution make peace and prosperity into the region? The answer is unfortunately no, because when we look at the current status of those societies, they are still demanding freedom, democratic rights, and institutional rights for their own wills. This is why, from my argument, it is not so easy to say that the revolution is already done in the region.
All right. So Mahjoob, Tunisia is usually referred to as a success story out of other Arab Spring countries. In your opinion, what did Tunisia do that other countries didn't do, and how is Tunisia faring now?
I'm not sure that the evaluation of Arab Spring is basically reflecting on the realities. We have to differentiate between Arab Spring as a process of change and between Arab Spring as an event. Arab Spring is a process of change and started 2010, but it doesn't seem that this chapter has been closed. That's the reason why we put this question about Tunisia. Tunisia, on the level of process, about the election, about the maintaining the status of the state, basically keeping the state together, avoiding fragility of the state or actually the failure of the state. Tunisia did succeed in doing so. However, this kind of success cannot apply on economy, cannot apply on social life. Still, the society and the state is struggling to maintain stability. Still, there is a poverty. Still, there is a debate about where the country should go. Still, there is a debate about how political parties, how political forces can work together. There is still a soul of marginalization exists there in Tunisia. That is the reason why I always look at Arab Spring as a process of change. And this process, basically, it takes time and it will have an outcome. And this outcome will not be a matter of, will not rely on one factor. It will rely on many factors and how they contribute together, basically.
All right. So, Maha, many had hoped for a democratic transition for Egypt, which is the most populous and most influential country in that region. What went wrong there?
Basically, and primarily, Egypt experienced a military coup that overturned a democratically elected president and government. So we in Egypt were the victims of a military, the return of the military in full force. And Egypt since 2013 has suffered the iron fist policy of dictatorship and repression. But as my colleagues have said, this is an ongoing struggle. It's ongoing because all the conditions that brought about the Arab Spring, the level of corruption, the level of poverty, the level of repression, the lack of rights and freedoms throughout the region are still very much there and even increased. The Arab world and Egypt in particular has not got rid of dictatorship, and therefore that struggle is ongoing, and it will continue to proceed, whether slowly, whether in waves, but it will proceed because the demands are there among the vast numbers across the region, and particularly in countries where there is extreme repression. We do not see the manifestation of it, but there is growing antagonism to regimes that have been in power for decades and have failed to deliver. A country like Egypt has 60% of its people living in poverty, according to the numbers of the World Bank. Now that is unsustainable in a country of over 100,000 people, in a country where there is a small elite ruling through dictatorship and authoritarianism. It is completely unsustainable.
So what has changed in Egypt, Ugur? I mean, what are the biggest hurdles before Egypt's democratization process? Is it the military establishment, as just Maha mentioned, or let's say foreign support?
I think we should consider all the supports of you mentioned together, because as we see, that's the military coup has already changed the structure that Mohammed Morsi done in Egypt. And then the revolution unfortunately bring out the human out of the humanitarian government for the Egypt. And then also the efforts for some great powers into the changing dynamics of Egypt that becomes more fragile, for vulnerable for the transformation of the Egypt. And then Mohammed Bouaziz, unfortunately, dealt with the punishment of Egyptian government that becomes more conflictual in the meantime of current politics.
All right. Much of social injustices and economic inequalities were the main reasons, actually, behind these uprisings. But as we've just mentioned, no significant economic recovery was registered, neither of those countries. How do you think these peoples cope with their lives now that the pandemic taking the heaviest brunt on them? What's the mood?
It's tough. It is tough on those countries. Actually, the anger is increasing because the epidemic itself has revealed more about the nature of the corruption, more about the lack of respect to the human being, the corruption within health sector, and the epidemic has sort of revealed that how much actually human being is not important under authoritarian regimes. So that the epidemic actually has increased more anger within the society, and the mood is actually people are remembering, why they went out in 2010, and they see the same reasons exist. Actually more, because after 2010, every survival regime of Arab Spring become more oppressive to its own people, become more corrupted, become more authoritarian, become more militarized, and securitize the political sphere. So basically, the mood is really bad, and the mood is really in a situation where the suffering is increasing, and the ugly face of corruption is actually become uglier and uglier, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Maha, and yet those countries, let's say like Syria, Yemen, in Libya, that they have descended into chaos and unfortunately civil war. Does having populations divided on sectarian lines make it harder to plant seeds or democracy, or does it have to do anything with foreign interventions?
I think the key is the determination of those in power to remain in power, with the support of regional and international powers. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen in Yemen and Syria and Libya is the old regime and the old order trying to hold on at all cost, even at the cost of killing its own people. And unfortunately, it has had the support of regional powers and international powers. Therefore, the reality is that the people continue to struggle not only against regimes in their own countries, but those that are supported and sustained both militarily and economically by outside powers. That interference reminds us of the constant interference that the region has suffered under since the early 20th century and even from the late 19th century. What we want is independence, the independence to choose and the independence to develop as societies that are part of a world order that should allow equality for all. We're not seeing that today, and the price that the peoples of the region have paid is extremely high. And the role of outside powers in the enormous loss of life, both in Syria and in Yemen and so on, is really one that is unacceptable. Yeah. And I think we need to speak out about the complicity of outside powers in supporting such regimes, because history will record that not enough was done in Syria. There was complicity by regional powers and even international powers. And the same goes for Libya and elsewhere in the region. The peoples of the region deserve better, and the outside world needs to listen, because this struggle will end. Whether it will end in more blood or less blood depends a great deal on the outside world.
All right, so Ugur, most of those countries have young demographics. I mean, what kind of a role did the younger generations play in spurring those uprisings? Are they satisfied? And what's next moving forwards? Because, I mean, 10 years ago, they were 20-year-old youngsters, let's say. Now they're in their 30s. So have they given up hope?
I think they are demanding still a revolution, because they need to get to live more better in circumstances, that they really want to live in a more democratic ways and more equal rights for income share, especially. This is also my argument that I agree with the Mahjoob arguments that still these countries facing with inflation, unemployment rate, and they are now facing with better world also of their countries. I mean, the younger parts of those countries needs to be more equal share and democratic way of life. This is why, including 10 years after Arab Spring, they are now really want to live in more equal conditions, yes, in their countries.
In a way, it was a revolutionary moment on a scale that no one haven't seen since the struggle for independence from colonial rule. Mahjoob, how has that fallout from the region impacted Europe, and how has the Arab Spring, let's say, changed the viewpoint of some Western capitals, or has it changed something at all?
Of course, it has changed. But again, I'm stuck with my definition, which is it's a process. And the process of change, basically, it will take time until you have the fruit of it. Of course, the Western powers, they wake up to the realities that there is oppression, there is an authoritarian regimes, and they supported those authoritarian regimes. That's the reason they were suffered themselves, those Western countries, of criticism, and they face a criticism, ongoing criticism, actually, from different groups within the region and outside the region. And the credibility of Western powers actually were tested and approved to be, they were lying. They were saying they needed democratization in the region, and when the people wanted so, they actually stand against all of this. We remember what Barack Obama did. We remember what France did, what other European countries, how they react. And we know how basically they change the course, and they become more supportive of stability against the dignity of the people. They wanted stability for the authoritarian regime rather than having a society which is more open, which is more democratic, which more people live with opportunities, with dignity. And all of this approved to be, they are not really supportive for these kind of elements. There is no doubt the change is happening, but it will take time. But the more important thing, actually, to this generation, that all of these claims from the West, that they are actually supporting the change, approved to be lie, and because it was tested in the Arab Spring and approved to be not true, and they're actually against change in the region because they want their interest first rather than the life of the people in the region.
So
or a better life for people in the region.
Yes. So, Maha, what kind of implications the Arab Spring had on the Gulf and other Arab countries, let's say monarchies, and what do you make of their reactions against this spring?
They were terrified of the Arab Spring because it defined what they fear most: the demand of people for accountability from their regimes and the demand for participation. And that model is one they do not want, because it's a model that will undermine the corruption. It is a model that will get rid of what the Arab world has lived with, which is elites that have lived off the wealth of their people. And what we've seen is a defensive mechanism from all these regimes, increasing repression, interference in regional states to ensure that there is no change. But they are ultimately on the defensive, despite the show of power, despite the aggressive policies that they pursue to undermine any democratic voice in the region or any democratic movement. They are ultimately the ones that will be marginalized.
But Maha, now without Trump's, let's say, protection, what's at stake for those countries? Do you believe they are able to sustain their positions, or they'll reposition them when Biden arrives in the White House?
Undoubtedly, they are under pressure. from a democratic administration and a Biden presidency, they will feel greater pressure. But that doesn't mean that the United States will interfere to change regimes. The United States has its interests in the region, and it will perhaps push for some cosmetic changes and possibly some real changes in terms of pressure for the release of prisoners, for better human rights conditions, and possibly these regimes under increasing pressures might comply. But the demands of the people of the region is, of course, for the release of political prisoners, for better human rights conditions, but it is for more than that. It's for the end of authoritarianism. It's for greater development and for the end of the corrupt practices of these regimes. And the Biden administration and the West needs to listen that their interests are not with these regimes. They are better served by democratically elected regimes. And ultimately, what the West has refused to accept is there needs to be mutual respect between nations and the nations of the Arab world as well.
Yes.
And until there is mutual respect and equality, the crisis will continue. And actually, not only the region's interests are damaged, but the interests of the international community are too, and are threatened by radicalization and terrorism, which we all claim to be fighting.
Yes. So, Ugur, what do you make of Turkey's role during the Arab Spring? Turkey now has not only become the biggest hub for refugees and exiles, but now it's facing an existential threat from northern Syria. What's your take on that?
Unfortunately, if the Turkey welcome all the revolutionary attempts in the region, that will be also nice for Turkey to become more democratic for those states. But we saw that at the end of these revolutionary movements, there was a power vacuum. This is why this vacuum has already landed with some extremist groups such as ISIS and then YPG. And this becomes a regional and national security threat for Turkey. This is why Turkey's position is following up all the issues very closely. And if they feel a threat for their, such as migrants and some terrorist attacks to Turkey, that Turkey are already stand its position to make a counter operation around its border, like a security concern, and the other needs for their national sovereignty. I mean, Turkey's position is already become a supporting partner for democratic movements. But if the supports of behind those movements come from out of the region, that Turkey becomes to use and secure their own national interests.
So much of looking back, what kind of lessons we can learn from those revolutions?
The first lesson, the respect to the human being and their demand for a better life. That's the basic things. The basic thing should be looked at. And this is the second lesson. Authoritarian in the 21st century should be stopped. People should be engaged in their political and decision making. People should be part of decision making process. They should not be isolated. They should not be marginalized. We are living in a world. If everything done by a group of people, we will have more instability, we will have more inequality and injustice in life, and which will produce radicalization and poverty in the world. And this is thing I don't think so anyone wants to see such thing expand in the world.
But Maha, are you hopeful that these countries will be able to realize their dreams as long as the Western nations, for example, continue to support those autocratic regimes and continue to sell, let's say, arms? Is there any chance or is there any hope for realizing their dreams?
People have to assert their power on the ground, and that's how change happened throughout the world and throughout history. The level of power that people have is often underestimated. They were able to bring down dictators by their sheer numbers and their organization. The West will listen when it sees the shift of the balance of power on the ground, because it'll know that its interests no longer lie with the dictators, and it has done so before. The West has frequently let go of its support for dictatorship the minute it saw the street move. The reality is that the West needs to be aware that the people will remember who stood with them and who stood against them. And in reality, for decades now, the West has sustained and made possible much of the repression we see through the Arab world. It's time for it to review its policies.
All right. Maha from London, Mahjoob from Doha, and Ugur here on set with me. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Aisha Subarkash. If you've got any comments, follow us and tweet us at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.